Okay, thank you very much. I want to talk about the face of God as it is used in the Torah, especially in Exodus chapter 33, a very dramatic theophany, the conversation between Moses and God after the episode of the golden calf, where Moses is trying to arrange for the forgiveness of the Jewish people, and to examine how Maimonides' understanding of this exchange was translated and commented upon 200 years after him by a Muslim living in Halab in Aleppo, and the point is by and large to demonstrate how difficult, if not impossible, it was to easily transfer the imagery and the accompanying philosophical interpretations from the Jewish context to the Islamic context, because some of the face of God is a phrase that appears in the Quran and in the Torah, but some of the accompanying imagery does not. And so my basic ultimate conclusion is an argument against comparative studies on this sort of allegorical interpretation of anthropomorphisms. I'll argue that in the matters of philosophy, where you start with a tabula rasa and a clear question such as, is there evil in the world? Do people have free will? Then the Jew and the Muslim can begin on the same point and reason by the same standards, and therefore the ideas can flow easily back and forth. But when dealing with scriptural interpretation, you begin with a fixed scripture, which has already set for you the corpus of images and put them in a certain context. And this dictates the way they have to be handled, even if the two thinkers would agree in principle that they should be interpreted allegorically. And that's I guess, the ultimate sort of methodological lesson that I wish to draw from this episode. Now, Maimonides deals with the face in two main chapters of his Dalalat al-Ha'irin, God of the Perplexed. First of all, in chapter 37 of the first part, which is a part of a series of chapters in which Maimonides discusses Hebrew words which are multivalent. And his basic point there is to show that these words already carry lexicographically in Hebrew a variety of meanings, and therefore when one wants to choose a meaning that, when these terms are applied to God, and one wishes to choose a meaning that would essentially rule out any materiality to be attributed to the God, one is not doing any violence to Scripture or forcing on Scripture something that doesn't belong there. These words have in them inherently this range of meanings, and one simply chooses the appropriate meaning in a particular context. And so there, in chapter 37, he discusses the Hebrew word panim, which means face. But he alludes to the much more critical discussion, which he will elaborate upon later, where the word face appears, as I said, several times at a very dramatic moment in the Torah. And that is later on in chapter 54 of the first part. Now there Maimonides talks about the word which as it appears in the chapter in Exodus, which describes one of the most critical moments in Jewish history. The Israelites have sinned by worshiping the golden calf and have already met with severe punishment. Moses has moved his tent far from the camp of the Israelites, and those seeking the Lord must now leave the camp in order to seek his counsel. God speaks to Moses face to face. Then, despite the grave sin, Moses is still instructed to lead the Israelites to the promised land. But he now requests that God inform him of his ways, that I may know you and find favor in your eyes. God replies cryptically Panaya elechu v'anichoti lach, my face will go and I will give you rest. Maimonides observes that Moses made two requests. First, he asked to know God's attributes, and this request was granted in the form of the 13 attributes, in Hebrew midot, listed later on in Exodus, and which came to play an enormous role in Jewish theology and prayer. However, Maimonides sees these as attributes of divine leadership and governance, which Moses will then imitate in leading the Jewish people, because the episode of the golden calf had revealed how much Moses needed instruction in political leadership. But then Moses made a personal request to know God's true essence and reality. In the words of the Torah, Hareini not kvodecha, show me now your glory. Maimonides interprets God's glory, kavod, as being entirely synonymous with his face. Both signify essence, that, and true reality, hakika. This request was denied. In its stead, Moses was granted a view of God's back, a chor. That word marks a comprehensive knowledge of creation that was then given to Moses, and which has not been apprehended by anyone before him, nor will it be apprehended by anyone after him. Now Maimonides is not totally oblivious to the Torah's placement of this dialogue in the context of the golden calf. Maimonides notes in one brief sentence that when Moses successfully pleaded that the nation be forgiven, but other than one remark, the lengthy discussion concerning discussion between Moses and the deity concerns what is attainable and what is not attainable with respect to knowledge of the God. Knowledge of God's true essence, or in the biblical phrase, seeing his face or glory, is simply impossible for any material being. On the other hand, some approximation to knowledge of God, namely apprehension of the manifold manifestations of divine governance in the cosmos, the biblical back of God, is not only possible but praiseworthy. Now, Maimonides takes up this same chapter again in his Hebrew language law code, the Mishnah Torah, written actually several decades before the guide, though he had been working on the guide since early youth. He didn't publish it till he was in his 60s. And Maimonides, though the Mishnah Torah is a legal compendium containing all the laws of Judaism, both including even the sacrificial laws of the temple, though the temple had not been standing for over a millennium, but he introduced it with a number of chapters on the basic theology, science, and philosophy, which he felt even the common people needed to know. And there he thought that this dialogue between God and Moses after the episode of the golden calf was important enough to include, because it tells us something about the limits of human knowledge. Now, but because maybe because this text was written for common people, he does actually elaborate a little bit more and clarify what these images mean. To see one's face is to know someone's by their face, is to have a clear and precise knowledge of that individual, which distinguishes that individual from everyone else. So you know perfectly well that individual is, and you can't confuse him with anyone else. To see someone's back, and he adds here also not just the back of the head, seeing from the back, but seeing their garment being an important, not used in the Torah, but used in later, in early rabbinic theology, gives a sort of imperfect knowledge. You can recognize that person, but you can't clearly distinguish him from anyone else. Now, Maimonides, as I said, this law code at least these introductory chapters of the law code were translated into Arabic and supplied with a commentary by a certain Al-Adin al-Hanafi al-Muwakkid in Aleppo in the late 14th century. Apparently, this Muwakkid collaborated with a fifth-generation descendant of Maimonides who had relocated from Cairo to Syria. And it's interesting to see how he translates these passages into Arabic and tries to handle them. And this gives, as I said, a handle on how certain some of the imagery is simply impossible to transfer, even if one can perhaps come up with some sort of translation that is correct according to dictionaries. So, with regard to the glory that Moses asked to see, here Al-Muwakkid translates Hakika with that exactly as Maimonides does. He has no problem with that. Face and glory, face in particular, of course, have their place in the Quran, and these meanings fit. What he has done, however, he has upgraded this philosophical interpretation to be a simple translation. In other words, instead of saying, face means the visage, but the real meaning is Hakika wa that, he simply translates it that way. And this actually was done as well by some Jewish philosophical enthusiasts in the Yemen who sort of skipped the preliminaries. It's clear that these things are not taken literally and translate the phrase by its philosophical meaning. However, when we're speaking of God's back, the Hebrew achor, he chooses kafah. Kafah is a perfectly good dictionary translation of the Hebrew achor. However, unlike the Hebrew achor, kafah has no extended meanings or figurative usage in Islamic thought. The word does not feature at all in the Quran. See, in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, and later in tradition, there is this pairing of panim v'achor, or achor v'kedem, front and back, and that plays a very important role in the figurative interpretation of these words when they're applied to God or in other usages as well. This has no parallel in Islam or in the Quran, and this leads to problems trying to translate this and get it across in a meaningful way to a Muslim audience. The Hebrew malbush, garment, is rendered by the Arabic homonym malbus, a trick that's used to this very day by people who don't want to make very much of an effort to translate. But again, the word in Hebrew has, in early rabbinic theology, has a lot of baggage. God is said to have, the world has created the heavens out of the light of his garment and things like that. And there's no parallel in Islamic thought, even in Sufism, as far as I know, the imagery of God's garment is not used. The most intriguing translation is that of the verse cited at the end. When God denies Moses' request to see his glory, God says, "Varitat achorai ufanai lo yira'u." You will see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Now here Muwakkid translates, "Fatanzuru awachir nuri wa awiluha la tara." Literally, you will see the ends of my light, but its beginnings you will not see. This happens to be the translation of that verse from Saadia Gaon's Tafsir, his Arabic translation and at times paraphrase of the Torah. But Saadia's translation takes its place in the context of an entirely different reading of the dialogue. Saadia takes the Moses' request to show me your glory to mean, give me a visible manifestation of your presence, something that I can see. And God responds by giving Moses, by what Saadia calls nur makhluk, a created light, which is again a sensible evidence of God, of the divine presence. But Moses cannot see the front part, which apparently is too intense, but only a sort of afterglow. So, taken in the context of Saadia's reading of the entire passage and his notion of what God's glory is and what Moses is asking for, this makes sense. But pulling it out and using it only because he has no other way of handling this passage, it leads to some sort of very choppy interpretation. It just doesn't sit well with the rest of his handling of the passage. Because for Maimonides, the created light is not part of his understanding of this passage. So again, the fact that the face of God appears together with the back of God and God's garment caused problems because only part of this could be fastly translated or transferred to the Islamic tradition. Now, just a few brief comments on Islamic thought. I'll use less time than I've been granted because I'm not sure my voice will last for even what I'll be talking. First of all, we notice that Maimonides, neither Maimonides nor Sartre and everyone else really had to go to any trouble to rule out the type of literal materialist interpretation that did have a strong presence in Islam. I looked at Fakhruddin Arazi's commentary on Ayat al-Kursi, especially وَأَيْنَمَّ تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you look, wherever you turn, there is God's face. And he begins, before even beginning to give his interpretation, he has a long and detailed and painful almost argument with people who he refers to as Hanbalis, who insist that this verse should be taken literally, that God has a material face. This is not a problem. This is not an element in the Jewish handling of these verses. But this just means that we can sort of skip to where Fakhruddin gives his interpretation and perhaps make a comparison there. But it's not so simple. The second thing I did was to look at William Chittick's book on the self-disclosure of God in Ibn Arabi, because he has there an entire chapter on the face of God. And it's interesting that when Chittick introduces the chapter, before he gets to the actual text of Ibn Arabi, it sounds very much like Maimonides. We have wajh, meaning that, and hakika, very much as they are Maimonides. However, as we remarked at the beginning of this talk, the distinctive usages of face in the Torah and the Quran perforce led to different figurative meanings being assigned to the word for visage. The Torah's sharp division between the face of God that cannot be seen and his back, which Moses at least was allowed to glimpse, directed Maimonides to assign face the meaning of true reality and back the manifestation of God's attributes of action. However, the Quran never speaks of God's back. Moreover, in the key verse of our topic, the Ayat al-Kursi, the Quran declares, wherever you turn, there is the face of God. Hence, face must mean, as Chittick says, not the reality that is the essence, but the reality that is God's self-disclosure. In other words, the face of the Quran has much the same meaning that Maimonides is assigned to God's back. So basically, if one wants, one can sort of tabulate all these differences, but I don't think they're very instructive for us, because basically, again, these people are simply are working with a fixed canonical scripture, which they have to tackle according to their indication, their own philosophical outlook. So there is a major difference between philosophy and philosophical theology and exegesis. Philosophers take the initiative in formulating questions, defining concepts, and developing mechanisms for evaluating arguments. Hence, there are no reasons a priori to hinder a Jew and a Muslim from pursuing identical philosophical agendas and arriving at identical conclusions. And Maimonides, in his chapters on theodicy, will bring into the discussion the Ashariya and the Mu'tazila, even though the book is a book of Jewish theology, but their ideas are clear and open for everyone to to understand and take into consideration. Social and linguistic barriers may interfere with cross-pollination or influence between like-minded thinkers, but not anything intrinsic to the philosophic enterprise. By contrast, in exegesis, and more specifically, when confronting the problem of anthropomorphism, thinkers must deal with a fixed and inviolable text. The uses of words such as face in a particular writ, their inclusion in phrases such as the face of God, their pairing with opposites or the lack of such pairing, and so forth, force the hand of the interpreters. So also the context in which these phrases appear. As we have seen, the more limited context of scriptural episodes like the golden calf, and the broader context of theological controversy, such as Arazi's contest with the Hanbalites. These musings account in part for the rationale of this paper and its limited scope, which does not venture beyond the Maimonidean family, where Maimonides already stands out in stark contrast to his father, who took the more traditional approach of seeing this dialogue as being one of expiation, and his son, who didn't want to choose between his father and his grandfather, so he brought both. The differences we encounter cannot be ascribed to differences, different scriptures that are within the Maimonidean family, and must be attributed to different choices. Maimonides stands out in particular for detaching the salient appearances of the face of God from the biblical context and accruing traditional interpretations. That phrase had been a feature of the dialogue in which Moses secures forgiveness for the sin of the golden calf. However, the expiation at Sinai makes only a cameo appearance in the guide. Discussion instead revolves around the impossibility of apprehending of the face of God. A Muslim commentator, writing 200 years later, made a valiant attempt at transferring Maimonides' interpretations to the language of Islamic theology. However, the incompatible images used in the Torah and the Quran made his work difficult, if not impossible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. My question is about the Jewish detractors of Maimonides. So in the guide, you mentioned, the theologians sometimes implying, Asherites or Mu'tazilates. So are there Jewish voices that were in terms of anti-anthropomorphism, challenging Maimonides? And especially what comes to my mind is this section, I would say, in the Zohar called Shir Koma, which has all of the fascinating, anthropomorphic descriptions of God with his, every period of things. And some scholars I have read that argue that actually the Zohar was in many ways responding to the, rationalist anti-anthropomorphism of Maimonides. So the question would be, what are the opponents within the Jewish context for Maimonides?
Okay, well that's a complex question, but briefly, yes, he had people who the first critic of his law code, who lived in the Provence, Avram ben David, said that there's no harm in if it helps you to, when you're praying, to imagine God to have a human figure, and there's no harm in that, even if it's not true. And I've heard that repeated to this day. Maimonides, of course, thinks that there's a great deal of harm, because one of your life projects is to cleanse your imagination of these ideas. But it's not. I mean, there's no one who would argue, no, this is wrong. God has a body. Now, with regard to the small treatise that you cited, Shir Koma, which basically describes God as a macroanthropos and gives the measurements of his limbs. It's interesting. Maimonides makes a positive reference to this in one of his early works, just mentioned as sort of some sort of interesting book. And apparently he tried to rub out, he changed his mind, but he also tried to rub this out from his written record unsuccessfully. He simply found a piece where he scratched it out and wrote in the margins, this is like a terrible book. But the Kabbalah and the Zohar, it's a much bigger story than just this one thing called Shir Koma. The Kabbalah and Maimonides became the two main alternatives. But the range of issues on which they differ go far beyond just the questions of anthropomorphism. I'm not sure that I think many capitalists would probably agree with Maimonides that not to consider God to have human the characteristics of the human body, but there are many, there's a whole slew of across the board they disagree.
Thank you for really interesting. Just a quick question, perhaps. You were referring to Maimonides and Langermann. Do you have? You probably have. Did the Karaites offer a different approach, or was it still their allegorical?
If you mean different in the sense of no, the Karaites were for the most part the Karaites that we're speaking of now were pretty much Mutazila, and they if anything they would have been in the forefront of attacking the people who took Shiur Komah to be a holy book and something like that.